Well, hello, good day. I'm George Wimberly, Director of Professional Development at the American Educational Research Association, AERA. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's workshop, Introduction to Qualitative Metasynthesis Methods, Achieving STEM Equity and Inclusion Through Syntheses. This workshop is part of the AERA and Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, ICPSR, and the Partnership for Expanding Education Research in STEM, Data Hub, or what we call PEERS. This is funded by the National Science Foundation. The PEERS Hub is a web-based platform, a convening place of sorts, that enables discovery through wide-ranging forms of education and STEM-related data. It connects researchers to networks for collaboration and communication. It promotes capacity building and research methods, data use, and responsible conduct in diverse forms of data. I encourage you to visit the PEERS Data Hub platform and become part of the Hub community. Today's workshop is part of a series in collaboration with the Institutes and Research Methods, or IRM, which, like the PEERS Hub, is part of NSF's Building Capacity for STEM Education Research program. In this method series, the AERA ICPSR PEERS Hub features the 11 institutes that seek to promote research expertise and applications of computational, quantitative, qualitative, and evaluative research methods useful for STEM to STEM researchers and to broaden the STEM professional workforce. This is our third workshop in this series, and additional workshops will follow approximately monthly throughout this year. As you may notice today that we are using, we have American Sign Language interpreters, and we have closed captioning services that are being provided today. I want to thank our ASL interpreters who are here and our closed captioners for the work they're doing providing these services. Earlier today, you should have received an email message from AERA that gives you access to some of the course materials that we're going to use. There's a link to this, and I'll put this link into the chat at some point here so you can pull some of the materials that the instructors have provided. And we are just so enthusiastic about today's course because last we checked, there were about 4,315 registrants for this workshop for about 108 countries around the world. So this is quite amazing, to say the least. And I want to just welcome you all. People are here from different corners of the world, different time zones, different hemispheres. So this promises to be definitely a very well-attended and informative workshop. So given that the large number of people who are on, I want to give you a few tips today. Some technical tips. So one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to use the question and answer box for general questions. And at specific times, I'm actually going to synthesize the questions and address our instructors. So you're free to put any questions that you have into the Q&A box in the Zoom feature. However, because there's so many people on, I'm going to ask that you refrain from using the chat box sort of for idle chit chat. We're going to be putting some links into the chat box at times so everyone can get to those easily. We'll display them on the screen too as well. So it really helps us a lot. Also, there are several polls that the instructors are going to use throughout this workshop. So this will remind everyone that your answers will always be anonymous and will only be shared with the class. The polls will pop up in Zoom, and there are a couple of times too we will use the Slido application, and the instructors will give you links to this where you'll be able to participate. One other really neat thing about today's course, now we're going to go until about, 1 to 4 p.m. Eastern time. We're going to then take a break, and our instructors have agreed to come back at 4:30 p.m. Eastern time, and we're going to have an informal discussion and question and answer period at this time. So right now, we're in a sort of a webinar mode. You can't talk to each other. and you can see us, but we can't see you. So what we're going to do is we're going to come back for sort of almost a party in a sense, where we can all meet and see each other's faces. We're going to meet from 4:30 p.m. to 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time. We're going to put a link in the chat, and we'll post this link. So anyone who wants to join, this is a time you can come. If you want, you can turn on your camera, and that we can talk and ask questions. Instructors, this will be a very informal time. We like to think about this if we were at the AERA annual meeting. This is everyone coming back together after the course. We're going to come back together at the local coffee shop in a hotel or something of that nature, and have a very informal conversation with the instructors. So, and of course, there's an evaluation. So all great research, of course, will have an evaluation part of it. So today, following the workshop, later this evening, you'll receive an email message from us asking you to complete a workshop evaluation. We ask that you complete this evaluation as soon as possible. AERA and ICPS we value your input and guidance as we develop professional development and training activities. We appreciate your candid feedback, any reflections that you can give us about this workshop. Also, the course registration here, as you've registered for this course, you have access to the live course, and you also have access to a course recording. We're recording this course, and in a few weeks, you're going to receive an email message from AERA telling you how you can access this course recording on the workshop, on the Peers Hub platform. So, all right, so let's turn now to today's workshop. We are pleased and just excited that not only that we have such a large group of participants, but we have an outstanding group of researchers who are here from the Institute for Metasynthesis at TERC. And this includes Maria Ong, Nuria Jaumot-Pascual, Lisette Torres-Gerald, and Christina Silva. 4 outstanding researchers who are here to share their expertise and talk about their program. And they will be available not only interacting throughout the course, and again, as I said, available at our post-course discussion. Ask that you'll feel free to join for both. And we're so excited that we can have this course on metasynthesis. AERA prides itself in offering professional development and training activities that cut across areas and research methods, from statistical techniques, quantitative and qualitative research methods, using large-scale data sets, as well as other research-oriented trainings around writing, publishing, and communicating research. And we're definitely, again, so grateful for our instructors to be here to share this workshop with us and share their expertise and talk about their program. I could go into a long introduction, but I'll let them do that. I know there's also information on the TERC website that gives you more of their background and some of the work of TERC. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Maria, who goes by Mia, Dr. Mia Ong, and allow her to start the course. Thank you.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, George. Welcome to our Peers Methods webinar entitled Introduction to Qualitative Metasynthesis, Achieving STEM Equity and Inclusion Through Syntheses. We want to give a warm thank you to our hosts, ICPSR and AERA, especially to Felice Levine, George Wimberly, and the AERA staff and tech team, and to our sponsor, the National Science Foundation, for the opportunity to share our work with you. We want to begin by acknowledging the various unceded, colonized lands of the United States on which each team member is located. We are honored to be located on the occupied Otoe-Missouri land of the state of Nebraska, the Cherokee and Muskogee land of the state of Georgia, and the Wampanoag and Massachusetts land of the state of Massachusetts. We have a lot to share, but as George said, please post your questions as they arise by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We will briefly pause throughout our presentation to take a few questions moderated by George, and then we'll leave plenty of time at the end to take more questions. We will take 2 short breaks at around the 1 hour mark and again at around the 2 hour mark. Given this webinar is being recorded, we will not be sharing the presentation slides. At certain points in today's presentation, we will be offering some hands-on activities and invite you to participate. For some of them, we will be asking you to go into the Dropbox to retrieve a brief document. Also in Dropbox, we have provided a reference list in case you want to do some additional reading about qualitative metasynthesis following the webinar. We will begin with some context for this work, starting with an introduction to my project team and a historical overview of the metasynthesis work I have led over the past 15 years that informs and frames today's presentation. Here are photos of our team. You'll meet each of us during the webinar. On the screen, from left to right, is me, Principal Investigator Dr. Mia Ong. I am an Asian American woman with mid-length black hair, and in the photo, I am wearing a gray blazer. In the next photo is co-PI Dr. Nuria Jaumot-Pascual, a Spanish woman with mid-length brown hair and dark-rimmed glasses and a black blazer and paisley scarf. In the third photo is Senior Research Associate and Project Coordinator Dr. Lisette Torres-Gerald, a Puerto Rican woman with short, curly, dark brown hair, red-rimmed glasses, dark-rimmed glasses, and a teal mandala shirt. And in the last photo is researcher Christina Silva, a Filipina-American woman with mid-length dark brown hair, red-rimmed glasses, and a black shirt with white flowers. Our research team is made up of minoritized women located in Massachusetts, Georgia, and Nebraska. We all use she, her, hers pronouns. In today's presentation, we will be going by first names. Here is a snapshot of all 4 of our qualitative metasynthesis projects. They have each been funded by the National Science Foundation, and they have built upon each other over the last 15 years. In our work, one main synthesis question we ask is, in what ways do women of color in higher education and careers experience supports and barriers on their pathways in science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, or STEM? We define women of color as women who identify as African American or Black, Asian or Asian American, Latinx, Hispanic or Chicana, Native or Pacific Islander, or multiple races or ethnicities. All our work is conducted in the United States. Our latest NSF-funded project, which began last October, is called the Institute for Metasynthesis, a practicum through the lens of STEM equity and inclusion literature, which for short we call the acronym IMSEAL, or the Institute for Metasynthesis. The purpose of this Institute for Metasynthesis is to offer a variety of workshops, seminars, and webinars, such as this one today, to teach qualitative metasynthesis methods and metasynthesis proposal development skills, with a special emphasis on STEM equity and inclusion literature. Our goals are to equip participants with skills for executing successful metasynthesis projects, publishing high-quality metasyntheses, and constructing competitive metasynthesis grant proposals, hopefully with an educational, equity, and inclusion focus. We believe that long-term outcomes will include an improved understanding of what qualitative metasynthesis is and enriched academic scholarship through the implementation of more and better qualitative metasynthesis funded projects and publications. Before we get into the mechanics of synthesis work, I will first provide brief definitions of qualitative metasynthesis and its counterparts, and provide a rationale for conducting a metasynthesis. I will then discuss one of my own synthesis projects and how its findings were translated into policy and action. So, what is a qualitative metasynthesis, and how is it similar to or different from a literature review or a meta-analysis? Most of you are familiar with literature reviews. A literature review is a summary of the literature organized by key concepts without additional analysis or interpretation of the findings in the literature. This is what we usually see in research articles and dissertations. Qualitative metasynthesis and meta-analysis take it further by reanalyzing the findings of the studies they include. The main difference between a qualitative metasynthesis and a meta-analysis is that the first one uses qualitative methods to arrive at its conclusions, while the second uses statistical analysis. A qualitative metasynthesis, which is the topic for today's webinar, employs analysis and interpretation of the literature to develop findings. Further, qualitative metasynthesis integrates the literature with the purpose of bringing a new or enhanced perspective or understanding to a particular topic. It can also develop new theory and unify disparate ideas and types of literature. In today's webinar, we will be presenting the pre-search and search and selection processes that can be used in all three of these methods. However, the rest of the presentation on coding and thematic analysis is most applicable to qualitative metasynthesis. If you choose to conduct a metasynthesis, you will have to decide before you begin whether you will conduct it alone or in a team. This will influence how long the metasynthesis will take and how you will approach the work. For example, if you are doing a metasynthesis solo, you will want a scope that is very narrow. On our projects, we have always worked in teams of about 4 people with external funding to cover our labor. It has taken us an average of 3 years to conduct a metasynthesis project that covers about 20 years worth of literature. There are 3 main purposes for conducting a qualitative metasynthesis. First, it provides efficient access to overviews of the literature and can quickly inform readers about a topic. Second, metasyntheses allow for theory development. And lastly, they are useful for informing policy and practice. In the next 2 slides, I will provide a brief history of a metasynthesis project that I led that frames the current webinar and exemplifies the third purpose of informing policy and practice. In 2006, I began a small metasynthesis project called Inside the Double Bind. This slide and the next have flowcharts composed of boxes interconnected with lines that show how Inside the Double Bind influenced decisions and recommendations in the following years. For this project, my team, consisting of a graduate researcher and 3 undergraduate students, and I developed a qualitative metasynthesis on pieces that had been published about women of color in STEM since 1970. This metasynthesis was published in the Harvard Educational Review in the summer of 2011 and is now widely known and cited in the field of broadening participation in STEM education. For example, it was quoted in an amicus brief submitted to the U.S. Supreme Court in support of affirmative action in the Fisher versus the University of Texas case. Continuing the previous slide's flowchart, my team and I next created a policy brief for promoting women of color in STEM, drawing information directly from the metasynthesis. In February 2009, I presented the policy brief to the Committee on Equal Opportunities in Science and Engineering, or CEOS, which is a congressionally mandated advisory committee to the National Science Foundation on issues of diversity and inclusion. CEOS members invited me to organize a mini symposium on women of color in STEM, which took place later that year. The mini symposium has since, directly or indirectly, influenced at least 7 additional publications on women of color. Further, the American Chemical Society was a co-sponsor of the mini symposium, and the ACS Women Chemists of Color organization was born at this event. Following the mini symposium, I authored a proceedings report. From this report, CEOS made 10 recommendations to NSF and US Congress for promoting women of color in STEM. NSF has acted on several of these recommendations, including funding at least 5 projects, such as annual conferences and web support programs. The recommendations are also referenced in the National Science Foundation's Career Life Balance Initiative. So I hope this gives you an idea of the ways that a metasynthesis project can not only quickly educate people about a topic, but it can widen the body of scholarship and influence national policy. Currently, we are completing another qualitative metasynthesis on women of color in computing and technology. The National Academies invited us to contribute our findings to their report on the experiences of women of color in tech, higher education, and careers. And that report will be coming out in the next few months. So let's now continue with the content of the webinar that focuses on the methods our team uses to conduct qualitative metasyntheses. Our team has designed a series of 6 modules. These modules listed here will give participants the opportunity to build skills in qualitative metasynthesis methods. All of the examples and hands-on activities will have a special focus on STEM equity and inclusion literature. Today, due to the limitations of time, we will focus on modules 1 through 4. Module 1 will address the pre-search process. In Module 2, we will address search and selection steps. Module 3 will focus on the early stages of analysis, including what we call first cycle coding, such as deductive and inductive coding. And Module 4 will look at the latter stages of analysis, including second cycle coding using thematic analysis. For those who want to learn more, following today's introductory webinar, we will be offering intensive webinars and workshops and written materials soon. Information will be provided at the end of today's webinar. I will now call on my colleague Nuria to present the next set of slides.
Hello, everyone. I will now talk about the stages involved in the creation of a qualitative metasynthesis. Here's a flow chart showing the first 3 stages of a qualitative metasynthesis and its substages: pre-search, search and selection of the literature, and analysis. You will see this flow chart in full and enlarged sections of it throughout the webinar to remind us where in the process we are. We'll start with Module 1, the pre-search process. Here's the top row of the flowchart showing the steps of the pre-search stage, and we'll enlarge it in the next slide. The pre-search stage is when you make the decisions that will frame and shape your qualitative metasynthesis. The synthesis question you will answer with your project, the theoretical framework that will guide your work, the search, selection, and quality appraisal criteria that you will use to identify the studies that will be part of your metasynthesis, and the search engines that you will use to search for them. As part of the pre-search stage, it is important that you first formulate your synthesis question. A synthesis question is similar to a research question, but our team calls it synthesis question to avoid confusing it with the research questions of the studies that will be synthesized in the project. And an appropriate synthesis question is particularly important for a metasynthesis project because it will help you to decide on the eligibility criteria that you will apply in the search and selection of the literature. It will also guide the entire research process. A viable question should be clear, and it should specify the scope of the metasynthesis. For example, a question our team has used for our previous project is, what factors influence women of color's persistence in undergraduate engineering education? To illustrate how the synthesis question will guide our work, I call your attention to the honeycomb graphic on the screen. Our example directs us to only focus on literature that is on women of color. So literature that doesn't address them will not be included. It also tells us that we are focusing on undergraduate education. So literature in graduate school or the workplace won't be part of the metasynthesis. It also indicates that it has to do with engineering. So we will not be likely to include literature that talks about STEM as a whole unless it disaggregates findings by discipline, including engineering. You then want to decide on a theoretical framework. The selection and use of a theoretical framework needs to be in line with the metasynthesis author's theoretical inclinations and be relevant to the topic or discipline. A theoretical framework will help to guide and direct the process. It can assist you with decision-making along the way, as well as provide additional insights on how to approach a particular synthesis question. Your choice of theoretical framework will also guide the analysis of the literature to develop findings for your metasynthesis. Together, your synthesis question and theoretical framework will keep your project clear and focused. Our team usually uses social justice-oriented theoretical framework, such as intersectionality or critical race theory. Many people do not name an explicit theoretical framework. However, they are using one whether it is explicit or not. It is better to make it explicit so that readers can understand the choices made across the stages. Having a theoretical framework can also help to guide coding, such as framing definitions for deductive codes. We will come back to this when we discuss deductive coding. Next, you will want to determine your criteria for the search, selection, and quality appraisal of the literature. These criteria support the identification of literature to include in the metasynthesis. They are a little different from each other, thus we will talk about them in different moments of the webinar. Here we focus on the search criteria. You will use search criteria to search for the literature you will include in the qualitative metasynthesis. You will need to consider how search engines work and how you can input search terms and dates to obtain the type of results you are interested in to get the most inclusive yet most targeted results. The search criteria will help in selecting search terms that will aid in identifying the literature that you want to keep for your metasynthesis and literature you want to exclude. Using the example of our team's engineering metasynthesis, some of the criteria that were helpful to consider during the search process were population, such as women of color for our team's metasynthesis, type of context, such as undergraduate education for us, disciplinary area, such as engineering in our case, and year of publication, in our case from 1999 to 2015. We will do a hands-on activity in a minute where we will think about the search terms that we can use to identify literature that fulfills our search criteria. Let's talk a bit about the importance of selecting search engines for a metasynthesis. There are various types of search engines you can use to search and select pieces of literature for your qualitative metasynthesis. The multi-search function in your institution's online access to its library is a good place to start for literature searches. Google Scholar, JSTOR, and ERIC serve a similar purpose of doing broad searches. In our team's work, we also included specialized engines such as the Web of Science or the dissertation database ProQuest, because we found that results tended to be more relevant and targeted. When you begin your search process, it is important for you to test a relatively large number and different types of search engines to assess which ones give you the highest number of relevant retrievals. In our metasynthesis on engineering, we tested 16 to select a final number of 7. When you select the engines you will use, you will need to learn the Boolean operators for each. These operators are the words or symbols used to include or exclude keywords in a search, leading to more focused and productive results. This should save time and effort by eliminating inappropriate hits that must be scanned before discarding. Boolean operators such as and, or, and not are variables that indicate whether something is true or false in a search. It is important for you to understand how they are used in your selected search engines, as well as how to use truncation to broaden your search. Boolean operators can also be used in combination with search terms, such as the ones we will see in our hands-on activity, to organize and filter your searches. This combination of words and Boolean operators, it is a search string. You will input these strings into an engine search bar to conduct your searches. Now we will do a short activity to think about search terms. We will briefly practice selecting search terms by thinking through the synthesis question that we are using throughout this webinar, and then breaking down the question into smaller pieces that allow us to identify potential search terms, such as the population we are focusing on, the discipline, the education level, and others. The synthesis question is, what factors influence women of color's persistence in undergraduate engineering education? Think about the honeycomb graphic we saw earlier as a guide to think about the search terms. Now, we will now ask for some audience participation. For those of you who were born in the spring, please go to the chat where you will find a link to our word cloud. Please click on the link and take the next few seconds, 30 seconds or so, to type in the search terms that you came up with. Christina will show her screen so that everyone can see the word cloud develop. Excellent. That's looking great. So notice how the cloud shows the words that most people thought would make good search terms for the synthesis question. In this case, women of color, engineering, persistence, STEM, undergraduate engineering. So there are people who are using combinations of words. Grit, interesting. There are also words that appear in smaller fonts. That means that fewer people considered them to be good search terms for this synthesis question. We see female, minoritized, success, college, university. And we see that there are words that continue to get bigger, like women of color. Excellent. Now, let's see how you can combine these search terms into search strings for your literature searches using an engine. We will come back to this, Cloud, later on. So now that we have practiced choosing search terms, it is time to conduct the searches themselves. We have switched the screen to show you how our team uses a combination of search terms and Boolean operators to build search strings and search for literature for the metasynthesis. I have put together a search string that includes terms that are related to our synthesis question. This would be one of several strings that you would put together in advance. As you use them, you should keep track to avoid duplicating the work. The advantage of using search strings is that it allows for more efficient searches. I grouped words that go together in parentheses. The first word relates to engineering, and the other groups of words have to do with the population we focus on. In this case, women of color. You can have other fields that relate to your synthesis question as well. In the case of our word cloud, there were words that had to do with persistence and with college or undergraduate education. So you would put them here grouped according to their field. So in this case, college, undergraduate would go together. And persistent and success might go together in a different parenthesis set. Excellent. Thank you, Christina. The asterisks are for truncation. And that means that the search engine will look for words such as engineer, engineers, and engineering for the first word, for woman and women, and females for the second set of words, and for African or Black in the third set. This third set of words would also result in literature with combinations of words that include African, such as African American. So it is not necessary to put both African and African American inside of the parenthesis. Notice that this specific search string focuses on Black women. You would build similar strings, but with different words in the third group of search terms to focus on other races or ethnicities, or to focus on women of color as a group, as a whole. The vertical bar and the Boolean operator or both indicate that we want at least one of the words inside the parenthesis to be present in the results. Google Scholar uses the vertical bar, but many other engines do not use it and use simply or. Now, when I press the search button, I will get results, which I will then limit according to their year of publication. We have set the search engine to find literature published since 2000 to make sure that we have relatively recent studies that are potentially relevant to nowadays realities. If you're doing a historical search, your custom range would obviously be different and reach back into the past. Notice that some results have a PDF associated with them and others do not. You can simply download the ones that are available in PDF form, and for those that do not have it, you will need to find them through your institution's library or using other strategies. You will go down the list of results and make decisions for inclusion. As you do this, you will save your decision by clicking on the quotation mark under the abstract and copying it into a spreadsheet or your literature management software. As you can see, the first result is about African American women in engineering in general. However, we don't know whether it disaggregates by educational level or the workplace. We will keep it for now until we have access to the full text and see whether that's the case or not. We will talk about how to systematically sift through the literature later when we talk about filter 1, filter 2, and quality appraisal. Now, we will take a few minutes to answer some of the questions from the audience. George, what are some questions arising from the Q&A?
Great, thank you so much. We're getting a lot of questions that are coming through. Everyone, our participants are out there. I'm asking you can put your questions in the Q&A box. Well, one thing that has come up is, can you both, either Mia or Nuria, if you can talk a little bit more about the distinction between a meta-synthesis versus a systematic literature review? That seems to be, I think there some people are a little confused. There's some ways can you explain that again?
Yeah, you want to go ahead, or do you want me to go ahead with that one?
How about I try and you can correct me as the the methodologist on our team?
Sure.
So we, one of our advisors on our project is Mara Borrego, and she has put out several systematic reviews, especially in engineering education. We have a lot of respect for the work that she and her team do, and we see a lot of overlap between our methods. I would say probably the one main difference is that meta-synthesis goes one step further. So later on, we'll be talking about thematic analysis, and there are 3 steps within thematic analysis. And one is the reaching descriptive themes, and the other is taking those descriptive themes and coming up with analytic themes. And I think that for systematic review, they stop at descriptive themes. I'll just hand it over to my colleague Nuria to comment.
So I will add to that. Also one of the differences is that with a review, if it's systematic, what makes it systematic are the search and selection methods to find the literature that you want to use. So systematic means that you're trying to get all the literature that exists out there related to your topic for the review, right? So systematic has to do with trying to have the broadest reach possible. We can never get all the literature because there's always a hole in our net somewhere, right? But that is the goal, to get as much literature as possible. Now, it's a review. So as Mia said, it doesn't necessarily do analysis, a reanalysis of the findings. It summarizes and organizes by main concepts. A synthesis doesn't necessarily have to be systematic. We make it systematic because we want to make sure that we are taking into account all the perspectives that exist out there about the topic that we are working on. So we actually do systematic metasynthesis because we use systematic methods for the search and selection, and then we use qualitative methods for the synthesis of the findings to get meta findings that synthesize and look for new understandings of what the literature found in studies that might be isolated between, among themselves, that we bring together in conversation for an overall understanding. of what's happening with the literature. Should we answer another question?
Sure. Another question. How have you decided upon the date ranges in your searches?
Mia, do you want to get that one?
Well, for some, it has to do with whether or not we're taking a historical perspective or not. So the very first one I did was on looking at I was very ambitious. I was very young as a researcher, and I wanted to look at all the research that had been published up until that point. And this was 2006 when I started. And what I did was I looked to see what was the earliest mention of research on women of color. And that was the survey study that was put out by Shirley Malcolm and her colleagues through AAAS. They did a survey of 30 women of color. They called them minority women at the time, who were scientists in the US. And the conference was in 1975, bringing all these women together. And the report, based on the survey and their findings, was put out in 1976. So I just went all the way back to 1970, just in case there was any lead up. And so that was an ambitious covering of about 40 years of literature. Since that study, that study that was published in 2011, we created a list of all the research gaps that had been that we were finding, and I'm really pleased that a lot of people took up addressing those research gaps since. And so there has been a burgeoning of this type of research on women of color in STEM and in specific STEM disciplines, and it's just been excellent to see. And so in order to address pressing questions like what can departments do right now to help students, especially women of color, in computing departments, we don't want to go back 20 or 30 years because it won't be helpful to them. So we go back, we go back maybe 10 or 15. So it really depends on what the question is, and the question will determine how far you want to go back and how much you want to cover. Another very practical consideration is your budget, your time and your budget. If you have 6 months to do something, you can't go back 40 years. You can't take on 10 to 15,000 pieces of literature, and as you saw there, it's there. So you have to really take into consideration, that's part of the decision making about how narrow is your scope. And so I would say it depends on your question, it depends on your budget, it depends on your time.
Great, thank you. If you want, I think we can continue. So
okay.
We'll keep us on track.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, George. Okay, in the second module, we move from planning the qualitative metasynthesis process to implementing the different steps to identify the literature we will include. Here is the second row of the flow chart that we've been using that shows the steps of the search and selection stage. We will enlarge it in the next slide. We are now moving on to the next stage of the metasynthesis process, which you can see in the flow chart. We will now focus on the search and selection process, which includes implementing the criteria we selected earlier once we are searching for and selecting the literature to be included. During the pre-search, we will choose a set of selection criteria. We use selection criteria, which are different from the search criteria, to select the literature once we find it through our searches. This criteria will be applied to literature that is potentially relevant in order to weed out studies that are not. We need to establish criteria that are not easy to include in the search, such as the type of publication that we want to include. In the example that we are using for undergraduate engineering, for women of color in undergraduate engineering, our team decided to include all empirical studies, independently of whether they were published in a book, in a report, in a peer-reviewed journal, a dissertation, or elsewhere. In some cases, for quality or convenience purposes, you may decide to choose to include only peer-reviewed articles. As Mia mentioned now in the Q&A, there was very little literature on these topics until very recently. So we chose to include dissertations, thinking that younger researchers interested in filling up those gaps in research would be creating dissertations that would address this topic. So for us, it was very important to include dissertations in our work. You might want to just include peer-reviewed articles if it's an area that has more literature than what we were looking at. This criteria will constitute a sift or filter that you will use to determine which studies will later be included in your metasynthesis manuscript. The studies that pass the filters will be our start set. What is the start set? A start set is the initial group of full-time piece. Sorry, I'll start again. A start set is the initial group of full text pieces of scholarship resulting from the implementation of our search strings using the selected search engines and implementation of the criteria. The start set will contribute to answering the synthesis question. The number of studies included in the start set will depend on how narrow your synthesis question is, how much research is available in your area of interest, and your goals with the metasynthesis. For example, in our team's metasynthesis on women of color in engineering, our start set was 35 studies. 35. To the start set, we later add the results of snowballing, which is a search strategy that uses the literature in the start set to identify additional literature. In our case, snowballing produced an additional 30 studies. So we had a total of 65. This is not an overly large number of studies to include in a metasynthesis, but you want to make sure that your number doesn't balloon too much because it can become unmanageable or difficult to analyze. If you have too much literature for the metasynthesis, you may want to reconsider your synthesis question or the criteria that you apply to narrow its scope and make it more manageable. The start set will be the basis for the subsequent searches using snowballing, searching for further scholarship to be included in the metasynthesis. So to get to this start set, we will need to do some filtering. This flowchart shows how the process moves from the pre-search process that we've seen so far to the search and selection of literature through filters 1 and 2, and through the quality appraisal step. After the 2 filters and the appraisal, we get the start set. In the next 3 slides, we will look at the 3 filters used to sift through the literature found through the searches. Filter 1 is a first approximation to the literature resulting from your searches using the search and selection criteria. You will use readily available information, such as abstracts, to make your decisions. Because the information you will have is quite limited at this point, you want to be pretty lax in the application of the criteria. Otherwise, you may eliminate studies that would qualify. You will be stricter later in the application of the criteria. So you will read the abstract, note which criteria the piece fulfills or may fulfill, that we are not sure yet, and which criteria it does not fulfill for sure on the tracking form, such as the table below. And eliminate those that clearly do not fulfill the criteria. The table, which can be an Excel document, for example, has a column for each criterion to be tracked, such as the publication date, whether the piece is on women of color, and whether it's on engineering. The rest of the literature that do pass the filter move to filter 2. It is important to keep track of all filtering decisions so that you can explain your methods later and so that you don't repeat work that you've already done. You will hear us repeat this throughout the webinar. It is important to keep track of what you've done, the decisions you've made, so that you can tell others what you've done and not have to remember something that you did a year ago. If you're working as part of a team, you should keep your filtering table in the cloud so that everyone knows what pieces of literature have already been filtered. And so everybody can be on the same page on where in the process and how it's going. In the example of the slide, you can see how after reading the abstract, Alonso study on the first row fulfills all the filter 1 criteria. So we will keep it for further examination in the next filter. Fleming's piece fulfills most of the filter 1 criteria, but it's unclear if it fulfills the criterion of being an empirical study. You keep it for now, and you will examine it closer in filter 2 when you have the full text of the study or the piece of literature, whatever that might be. Filter 2 is a closer examination of the literature resulting from filter 1 for a much more stringent application of the exact same material, of the exact same search and selection criteria. You will need the full text for the studies that you're considering so that you can read through them for the necessary detail to make your decision. You will then note which criteria the piece fulfills and which criteria it does not in the same tracking form you used for filter 1, and eliminate those that do not fulfill them. The rest of the literature will move on to the quality appraisal step. In the example on the slide, you can see how after reading the study's full text, Alonso's piece continues to fulfill all the filter 2 criteria. So you keep it for further examination in the quality appraisal. Fleming's piece fulfills most of the criteria in filter 2, but it clearly does not fulfill the criterion of being an empirical study. One of our criteria in this study was that they needed to be empirical studies. It cannot be a thought piece, it cannot be a theoretical piece or a methodology. It has to be an empirical study with findings. So in this case, Fleming is not a study, so we had to eliminate it from our pile of literature to consider for the synthesis. So we would need to discard it at this point, so it does not continue to the quality appraisal. To ensure that you produce a metasynthesis of quality, it is necessary to include a set of criteria that addresses the minimum standards acceptable for a study's inclusion in a metasynthesis. Like with the previous filters, you will select the criteria that make the most sense for your study. And these are usually related to quality and consistency of the methods and evidence used in the study, such as whether it includes a research question and methods and whether it contains sufficient evidence to support the findings. The process for quality appraisal typically includes reading through the study and noting which criteria the piece fulfills and which criteria it does not in the tracking form, and eliminating those that do not fulfill them. For our team, judging whether a piece of literature fulfills each criterion is a matter of whether it is present at all, not the depth to which it is present. If it is present, we note it as a yes in the tracking form. If it's not, then it's a no. And for the literature that has all the yeses, then we make the decision to keep it. By the end of the quality appraisal process, all the literature that receives a decision of keep comprises the start set. The quality appraisal tracking form at the bottom of the slide shows examples of the criteria our team usually selects. Continuing the example we have been looking at, you see that Fleming's piece was discarded in filter 2, so it does not appear in our tracking form anymore. Alonso's study fulfills all the quality appraisal criteria, so you need this piece of literature to include it in the metasynthesis as part of the set. I will talk more about the start set in a few minutes. So, how do you do quality appraisal? Now, we will do a poll to think about quality appraisal criteria. There are many criteria that you could include in a quality appraisal. However, the more stringent you are, the more likely you are to eliminate studies from your metasynthesis. Take 30 seconds to consider which of the criteria that will appear on your screen you think are the most important for you to include in your metasynthesis. Everyone can participate in this poll. Vidya, can you put up the poll, please? So we have those options: research design, research question, description of context, description of participants, theoretical framework, limitations, sufficient evidence, description of data collection methods, description of data analysis methods, and other. Please keep voting, and we'll have another 10 seconds or so for you to vote, and then we will share the results to see what everybody thinks. Can we see the results? Okay, let's see what everybody thinks. So most people think that research question is one that needs to be part of the quality appraisal. Our team would agree with you. The description of the data collection methods is together with the research question first contender for the first place. We would agree with you as well. Then we have the research design. Well, this might be a surprise for you, but we originally agreed with 57% of you. But what we found is that a lot of papers, a lot of studies do not name the research design that the researchers used to conduct that study. So in that case, if that was one of your criteria, you might have to eliminate a good bunch of the literature that you find. So you might need to reconsider using the research design as your criteria, as one of your criteria. Analysis methods, 54%. We would agree also, but people tend to explain data collection methods in the literature that we have seen than analysis methods. So that is one thing that you would need to balance as you are deciding which of this criteria would be important for you to include. So for us, limitations was one that we thought was important, and we ended up needing to eliminate it to make sure that we didn't eliminate half of our literature because it did not have the limitations described in the paper or chapter that we were considering. Okay, now we're going to move on to the start set. So the set of literature resulting from filter 1, filter 2, and quality appraisal is the start set. As I mentioned earlier, your start set will vary in size according to your research question, how much literature is published in that area, and your goals for the metasynthesis. It may be small at this point, but it is the basis for further literature searches through a method called snowballing. So your full set of literature will grow with the following steps of the process. We will now take a 10-minute break. So now it is 2:06, so we'll be back at 2:16. And after the break, Christina will take the mic and tell you about forward and backward snowballing, which are part of the systematic search and selection processes for the methods that we use for qualitative metasynthesis. Okay, see you back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone, I know there are a lot of questions that are coming through. We're keeping up with these and synthesizing the questions, and we'll be asked at different points throughout the course. Just to let everyone know that although the PowerPoint slides will not be available, that after the course, you are free to always know the instructors to reach out to them directly via email or to visit their website.
Okay, it is now 2:16. I will wait just one more minute before I begin. Hello, everyone. My name is Christina. And as we wait, I will just say that we're going to move forward with the forward and backward snowballing process that will answer some of your questions about the how you manage going through search engines with over 17,000 results, 15,000 results. And that's something that I'll cover as we discuss forward and backward snowballing. So here we are in the flow chart. We're here in the latter half of the literature search and selection process. And as Nuria mentioned in the previous slides and before our break, we have established our start set. And I'll now talk about additional search and selection methods called forward and backward snowballing to establish a full set of literature to include in the metasynthesis. So first things first is, what is snowballing? Snowballing is a process we conduct during the search and selection phase of identifying additional literature for our metasynthesis. It takes pieces from the start set and uses them to look for more literature. Like the process of creating a snowman by accumulating snow into a large circular mass, snowballing helps us to identify pieces of literature that you may not currently have by utilizing the references of literature pieces and the cited by feature on search engines like Google Scholar. There are two kinds of snowballing that complement each other, and they are called forward snowballing and backward snowballing, and they can be done in any order you choose. For the literature that emerges during forward and backward snowballing, you will apply the same selection filters we've discussed before, and those are filter 1, filter 2, and quality appraisal. As I mentioned before, there is no particular order that you have to follow when you decide to snowball. Today, we will begin with forward snowballing. Forward snowballing is a sampling strategy used for literature searches that help identify pieces of work that may be relevant to your metasynthesis. By using the cited by feature, you are able to see what recent publications may have cited a piece in your literature start set. Not every search engine offers a cited by feature, but if they do, you should utilize it for getting additional literature for your metasynthesis. Forward snowballing is particularly useful when seeking pieces of work of that may have more contemporary examples of a particular topic. Here is a screenshot of the cited by feature in Google Scholar. And we've used Mia's very first synthesis, which was called Inside the Double Bind, a synthesis of empirical research on undergraduate and graduate women of color in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And since 2011, over 816 pieces have cited her work. I will now demonstrate to you how to forward snowball using Google Scholar. Before I switch screens, the literature piece that I will use for forward snowballing is a 2012 publication written by Renata Ravello Alonso called Work in Progress, Understanding the Experiences of Women of Color in Engineering. A PDF of the article entitled Alonso_article is in the Dropbox for your reference. For the purpose of this demonstration, we will use a synthesis question we've been using for the past hour or so. What factors influence women of color's persistence in undergraduate engineering education? So I will now switch screens. And as you can see here, I've already put in the title of the piece. And when I search it, it's going to be the first and only piece in the search results. And as I showed before, here's some two icons that you've seen in previous demonstrations. And in that photo that I showed, it's a star, the cited by, the citation, which you can use for MLA, APA, Chicago, and other citations, depending on how you're publishing. And then the cited by feature, which is what we're talking about today. And here, since its publication in 2012, Alonso has been cited by 6 people. So I'm going to click that, and it's going to populate the 6 results. And as we look at these results, some of the pieces that stand out to me in terms of answering the synthesis question is this first piece, counter spaces for women of color in STEM higher education, marginal and central spaces for persistence and success. And you may wonder why I think that piece is interesting to me, because it's not specifically talking about engineering, but it is about STEM. And as you know, STEM encompasses engineering. And I'm going to want to look at this piece closer to make sure whether or not it disaggregates data by discipline. So that would be interesting for me to look at for filter 1. But if we go further down, we see that we have within group differences of engineering identity for Latinx engineering students. So that to me definitely stands out as a piece that fulfills most of the criteria that we've discussed. So it's about women of color, it's about engineering, and it's about students. So it's fulfilled those 3 criteria that I'll now put towards filter 1 at a later point. And as we discussed, you're going to want to save all of these different titles by using the citation feature and picking the appropriate citation based off of whether you're using APA or MLA, and saving that in that tracking form that you saw in previous slides. One thing that I'd like to note for you is that sometimes forward snowballing may have dozens, if not hundreds, of cited by results. And you saw that when Nuria did the search string, that it came up with 17,000, but it first started at 23,000 without the time restraints. And due to limitations of time, I can't read through every single title that comes up in these search results. However, Google and other search engines organize the results based on relevance. And so my strategy and the strategy that my team uses to look through the search results is that I'm going to keep looking through all of the pages until I've reached 3 consecutive pages that don't show results that are relevant to my synthesis question. And that's when I'm going to stop. And that's a technique that we've used over the past decade or so since Mia has started doing syntheses. And that's really helped with kind of maintaining our time so that we can move forward with the next search engine or the next piece we're forward snowballing. So now let me switch back to my other screen. Okay, so now we're going to talk about backward snowballing. Now that we've gone through some forward snowballing, let's discuss backward snowballing, which is the complementary process to forward snowballing. And it's similar because it's another sampling strategy to identify works to include in your metasynthesis. But it's different because it utilizes the references of a literature piece rather than the cited by feature. So for example, here's the references of a piece by Lord and Camacho. And I'm going to use the same criteria that I've used for forward snowballing. And you look at the references of a piece and you examine the titles that have been cited by the authors. When you backward snowball, you're going to be looking at older pieces that may be relevant to your research topic or synthesis question. As you see here, I've already identified 2 pieces that appear relevant to the synthesis question: what factors influence women of color's persistence in engineering education? So there's this piece by Anderson and Kim that was published in 2006, and this piece was published in 2009, and this other piece by Babco, which was published in 2000, and again, that's previous to this publication that we're looking at for the references in 2009. So now I will demonstrate to you how to backward snowball, and you're welcome to follow along with the Alonso article, which you can find in the Dropbox. So like before, here's the article that we've been working with, and it's work in progress, understanding the experiences of women of color in engineering. I'm going to go through the whole paper and end up here in the references. And what I'm going to do, I've already highlighted 2 pieces that I found were most relevant to the synthesis question: what factors influence women of color's persistence in engineering and undergraduate engineering education? And the first 2 pieces that stood out to me for this exercise was Carloni and Johnson's Understanding the Science Experiences of Successful Women of Color, Science Identity as an Analytic Lens, and Tate and Lynn's How Does Identity Shape the Experiences of Women of Color Engineering Students? And again, the Carloni and Johnson's piece doesn't exactly explicitly say engineering, but because there's the possibility that within their study, they may have disaggregated their findings by discipline, this is going to be interesting to me to look through filter 1 and then move it towards filter 2, which is when you're going to read through the whole piece and identify whether or not this piece is going to fulfill filter 2's criteria, and if it will move forward into the final filtering of quality appraisal. And as we see here in Tate's, it does fulfill on the surface both filter 1 on women of color, engineering, students. And so that's going to go through those same filters. Filter 1, filter 2, you're going to read the whole piece, and then you're going to go through and do quality appraisal. So let me switch my screens again. Okay. So you're probably wondering, when do we stop snowballing? As an expert in snowballing, Klaus Wolin recommends continuing snowballing until no new references come up for the metasynthesis. A caveat to this process is practicality and budget. There is a limit on the time and energy that one can devote to this step of the process, and consequently, it is difficult to reach a saturation point like recommended by Wolin. Our team stopped at the snowballing of snowballing. In essence, we did 2 rounds of snowballing. And what does that mean? 2 rounds of snowballing is we do a first round of snowballing from our start set to get to a full set. But if you want to extend your literature further so that you're encompassing more studies to include in your metasynthesis, you're going to snowball those pieces you've snowballed from your start set. And that's how you get snowballing of snowballing, and you're doing 2 rounds of snowballing. To see if you've reached a saturation point, you may want to contact the authors of the literature included in your metasynthesis to see if they have suggestions on other publications to be considered for inclusion. Authors' contact information is either at the beginning or at the end of an article so that readers can contact them. It is acceptable to contact authors about things related to the article, and most usually appreciate knowing that their work is being read and considered as part of a meta-synthesis project. And one thing that I'd like to note about this caveat about the snowballing is that there's so much literature out there that it's going to be difficult to always be encompassing. But if you're doing the snowballing and then you're reaching out to authors, feel confident that you're doing your due diligence of reaching that saturation point. So I want to do another hands-on activity where you follow along with me on the computer how to do forward snowballing. And what I would like to do is use a new piece using the same synthesis question: what factors influence women of color's persistence in undergraduate engineering education? So take a moment and go onto your web browser and Google and put in Google Scholar. You can go on Google Scholar, or you can go to scholar.google.com. And at this point, I would like you all to look at the chat and copy and paste that reference, Litzler and Samuelson, how underrepresented minority engineering students derive a sense of belonging from engineering. And while you're copying and pasting that into the Google Scholar search bar, I'm going to switch my screens. So I hope that we're all at the same screen of Google Scholar, and you've typed in or you've copied and pasted the reference into Google Scholar. I've just put the title of the piece, and now let's together press the search, and we should be on the same page. And that's going to be the population of the Litzler piece. It should be the only piece on your screen, and it's going to show again the title in this PDF, so that means you have access to it. And then you see the abstract that we've shown you, and those two icons of the star, the cited, the citation, and then the cited by. That's the piece, that's the button I want you to press. So you're going to press cited by 25. And you click that, and you're going to see the 25 pieces that have cited Litzler and Samuelson census publication in 2013. And you're going to see scroll all the way down at the bottom that here Google has populated 3 pages of results. And as I said before, if Google populates more than 3 pages or more than several hundred results for a piece, whether you're working your start set or you're snowballing, remember that rule of you're going to keep looking through the search results until you've reached 3 consecutive pages of irrelevant literature that is related to your synthesis question, okay? So as you see, here's that counter spaces for women of color in STEM higher education piece we've seen before when we were looking at the Alonzo forward snowballing. Here's another one that looks interesting and relevant to the synthesis question of what factors influence women of color's persistence in undergraduate engineering education. So this is a cultural wealth perspective on success and persistence on engineering for Black and Latino students. And this is interesting to me because although it doesn't explicitly say women of color, or females, it does say students. So maybe this may fulfill my filters. If I go into the piece and I see that they disaggregate by gender, if their data or their findings talks about, Black women persist because of this, or Latino women persist because of that, that's how we also are inclusive of literature that may not have popped up in our original search results of the search strings being focused only on gender. Okay. And so that's kind of how our team looks at the literature, even if the titles or the abstracts don't specifically speak to the disaggregation. That's how you get into filter 2, to make sure that the findings that are discussed in the paper fulfill the criteria of it talking about women of color. And then a third one that looks like would be relevant to our synthesis question is an examination of Black women's experiences in undergraduate engineering on a primarily white campus. And here, this is kind of what would fulfill all of those filter ones, that it's about Black women, that it's about undergraduates, it's about engineering. And so those are some examples, and we could keep going on into the other results, but this is just to help you kind of get an understanding of how to use the Google Scholar cited by feature. So let me take a moment and switch my screens again. And we're going to go here. And once you've identified all of the pieces you have forward and backward snowballed, you are going to apply again those filters 1, filters 2, and quality appraisal to reach a full set of literature for the metasynthesis. And once you have a full set of literature, you will be able to move forward with the next step of analyzing the literature, which we'll discuss shortly after this Q&A. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. An excellent presentation, and I feel like I'm learning so much here about searching and all. We have a few questions that are coming in the Q&A box. One question is about the search engine. Should you do forward and backward snowballing across different search engines? And can someone speak to that?
Mia, I will take this one then. So for the initial searches, we recommend using several engines because they may have different types of literature in them. For example, when we were doing our engineering synthesis, we found that Engineering Village had a lot of peer-reviewed articles, but did not have dissertation. So we used a dissertation database to look for those. So you need to figure out what you're getting from each different engine. And then in terms of forward and backward snowballing, you will need to find a search engine that has the cited by feature. Not all of them have it. So I know that Engineering Village has it. So you can use the cited by feature from Engineering Village, or you can use Google Scholar. We use Google Scholar because it seems to have more, to include more things. For some reason, it's faster at getting at newer publications that have cited them. But we don't use several search engines for the cited by. We just use one because it is very detail-oriented work. It takes a lot of time. And usually with what we have found is that with one of them, with Google Scholar in our case, we can actually find almost everything that's out there using the cited by, and then the backward snowballing with their reference pages. So I would not recommend doing more than one engine for forward snowballing. It's a lot of work. A lot of work.
Thank you. Sort of along that same line, we have a lot of people on today, we're saying from 108 countries, and people who are studying issues around diversity and equity and topics around education and STEM. Much of this literature may not be in the top tier peer-reviewed journals, for example. What would your recommendations be if you want to make sure that you're capturing, say, things published in other journals and books, sort of maybe the gray literature, some might call it, things that are published in different languages as well?
I can take this one, Nuria, and you can add. So the topic we chose, especially when we started in 2006, did not have a lot of literature to it. And if we were going to be very strict with our criteria and say that it must be in peer-reviewed journals, the outcome would be very, very limited. And what we did was have a more open stance towards the literature and said, if it fits the topic and it fits the criteria that we have in our filters and our quality appraisal, we will accept it. So there is, it's not that we would accept just anything, but we didn't care about the source. So we have accepted dissertations, which can fall into the gray literature category, conference proceedings, book chapters, some reports. So we are more open, but that is because we are limited. And so it really depends on, the topic you choose and whether it has a lot of literature already populated or not. And I would also say that there is a bias against pieces that are not published. And that is very rampant in academia. I will say personally that some of the best pieces I have read are unpublished pieces. They are dissertations. They are some conference proceedings or conference papers. And I will. And another thing is that these dissertations, especially, they are the cutting edge of where the field is. If you want to see what the field, where the field is headed, read the dissertations. Not all of them are of the highest quality, but many of them are very, very good.
Hey, thank you.
Also, I wanted to address one thing briefly. Because our research is focused on the US, we don't really look at literature in other languages. I was off of the webinar for a second looking for a reference that we had. I'm not completely sure, but I found it. It's called NDLTD Global ETD. So let me copy it so you can have it. I'm going to put it in the chat. It's like a meta search engine. Where's the chat? Hold on. Let me open it. Oh, here it is. That we used, and you can choose which language you want to use. So it has things from Japan, Germany, Sweden, the US. So, and you can choose which of those engines you want to use. So it is a meta search engine. It's ginormous. Now you need to be careful with that because the more you open up your search, the less specific and targeted the findings are going to be. Okay. So it may be useful for you to find other search engines and then go straight to them to do more targeted searches. Otherwise, it's a barrage of like law cases. It's like, we don't use law cases, So it depends on what you want to do. But it's a good starting point to look for other search engines. I hope it's helpful.
Yes, thank you. One more question here. So as you talk about the articles you're using for forward and for backward snowballing, do you conduct the snowball on every article in your start set?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Yes, we do, and that's one of the reasons why this kind of work is so work intensive, because we do. So, she has talked about snowballing of snowballing. So we have done snowballing with the pieces that resulted from snowballing. So you can eternally be doing snowballing if you wanted to, but you need to stop at some point. So in our case, we stopped at snowballing off snowballing because I think we found like one piece after a lot of work. So yes, we do snowball every single piece off the start set. And that's one of the reasons why it is systematic. We don't pick and choose which ones we're going to snowball. We snowball all of them. In some cases, if they're very new, they still are not cited by anyone. So all you can do is backward snowball. Just look at their references. But the attempt is there of looking at whether they're cited or not.
I'll just say, and I this may have been touched upon by Christina already, but the beauty of forward snowballing is you get to see what has been published since that piece in your start set has come out. So if you have a piece in your start set that's 2018 and you do a forward snowballing, you may be pleasantly surprised to find that there are some pieces that have been published that cite that piece in 2020 or 2021. That gives you an opportunity to include the very latest research in your synthesis. And that, for me, that always feels really good.
Along that same line, too, is that there have been several questions about having access to certain texts. What is your process for when you can't necessarily access the full text? Is that Mia, Nuria?
Can you repeat the question? I actually got distracted.
Oh, no. Okay. So, no, there have been a lot of different questions come up about. So you're searching, you're doing your search and using different search engines, but yet at the same time, you may not be able to access the full text. How do you account for those pieces in your search?
So far, we have been able to find everything. Have we? So we use all means necessary to find the literature. So we have access to, I have access to the UGA library because of my affiliation with UGA. I'm a graduate of the University of Georgia, so I have access to UGA's library. When Christina was a student, we had access to her university's holdings. We do all kinds of searches thinking about where this can be located. So we look at the organization where the authors work at, and also what we have done is we contact the authors themselves, and we have gotten pieces of literature that way more than once. And usually authors are happy to share, especially knowing that it's being considered for a synthesis, because then it means that their work is going to be disseminated beyond anything that they had ever planned to do before. So they may get a lot more exposure than they planned to. We have used interlibrary loans, everything.
And I'll just add that we all work at a nonprofit, and so we understand what it's like to not have ready access to a university library or even, the university library's electronic system. And it's very challenging when you're in that position to do a synthesis in a place like a nonprofit. I have, over the years, become a big proponent of open access literature because of these reasons. There is, it's an equity issue, right? That people should have the literature to do the work, to do this scholarship. That said, we have, as Nuria said, any and all means necessary. And for me, that included hiring undergraduates who were interns, who were happy to use their affiliations to get that done. I will echo what Nuria said. People are very generous if you contact the authors about sharing their work, and they're very, very gracious. There is an increasing amount of work that is being put out for free on places like Google Scholar or Academia EDU, or what's the other one? ResearchGate.
ResearchGate.
Thank you. And so I think that, and also journals are offering an option of more open access. I think, the authors have to pay for it or their institutions have to pay for it, but that is an option that's given, and that's an option we have taken in our last 2 publications.
Great, thank you. There's just been so many good questions and comments coming through. I think everyone is so pleased with these presentations. And I'll remind everyone, we have a time toward the end where I know there's much more open discussion and questions. So I will pause and let you turn things back over to Mia and Nuria.
So I think Lisette will be discussing coding.
Thank you, Mia. Hello, everyone. I'm Lisette. We will now transition to learning concepts from Module 3, Intro to Analysis. So let's continue moving through the flowchart that we have been utilizing since the beginning of the webinar. We are now at the last stage that we will cover for today, the analytic process. Here is a flowchart of the 4 iterative cycles of the analytic process of qualitative data, where you repeat the process and improve upon it with each cycle. Coding is the first of the 4 cycles where you develop codes by looking closely at the literature or other types of data. After generating codes, which are closely related to the data and are more specific, they are grouped together according to similarity or differences according to themes, which are not as closely linked to the data and are a bit more general. Later in the process, these themes get translated into findings and discussion, getting more general and abstract with each step so that our claims can be applied to the literature in our meta-synthesis in general. In the interest of time, we will discuss the first 2 cycles, codes and themes, and will only briefly introduce the last 2 cycles at the end of the webinar. The first cycle of analysis, coding, is an iterative process where you examine your data and identify common links between each piece of data. A code can be a single word or phrase, such as familial capital. Today, we will talk about 3 types of coding approaches: deductive, inductive, and hybrid. Keep in mind that there are many other coding approaches, and these are the ones that our team uses in our metasynthesis work. In metasynthesis methods, when coding, literature is considered to be your data. So you may hear us interchange data and literature during the rest of our presentation. Deductive coding is a top-down method by which you use predetermined codes based on a particular theoretical framework, practitioner experience, what you know about the literature, or your research questions. This approach is typically used as a first cycle coding approach, a process used when we are first getting familiarized with the data. The image to the right of the slide shows how the process moves from theory to developing codes, and then how those codes are used to code the data. If we are using Tara Yosso's theory of community cultural wealth, for example, one concept that may be used as a code would be familial capital, highlighted in orange, which is defined as the cultural knowledge nurtured among family members that carry a sense of community history, memory, and cultural intuition. In this case, the term familial capital becomes the code with which you code your own literature. Here, it applies to a piece in our team's metasynthesis where the author describes how Monica, an undergraduate student, struggled to pick a major due in part to a lack of family guidance. Inductive coding is a bottom-up method by which you develop your codes as you identify them in your textual data. You move from specific observations that you're making based on what you see in the data to generating your own codes rather than starting with a preset list of codes. Like deductive coding, inductive coding is typically a first cycle coding approach, a process used when we are getting to know our data. The image to the right of the slide shows how the process moves from the specific data to developing codes that can then be applied to other sections of the data. Here is an example from our literature set, which comes from the same dissertation work previously mentioned and is highlighted in gray. The author describes how the student, Monica, is talking about soliciting advice on choosing a major. She says, I feel like I haven't had a clear advisor. I go to people and I tell them how I feel, but they don't really know what to say back to me. Based on her description of her experience, we developed a code called Supports Advisors. The final coding approach we'll discuss today, hybrid coding, is a method that uses both inductive and deductive coding practices. It is a combining of the codes that are generated from the data with theory-driven codes. It also means modifying existing codes and inductively creating subcodes to encompass new elements of the theory-driven code that were not included in its initial definition. In the example on the screen, both the deductive code familial capital and the inductive code supports advisors would then be used to code the literature set. Our team practices hybrid coding in all of our projects. We usually start using deductive coding, and then we develop inductive codes as needed when data do not fit the existing codes. Inductive coding also helps us in adapting or expanding existing codes. We will now talk about how to develop a code book. When our team codes, we utilize primary and secondary codes. Primary codes are umbrella codes that encompass a main idea, such as social discomfort. A secondary code is a subcode that falls under the primary code. It focuses on a particular aspect of the main idea. In this instance, isolation is a particular kind of social discomfort, as well as microaggressions, spotlighting, and stereotype threat. Another way of referring to primary and secondary codes is parent and child codes. Our team recommends that you record your codes in a document called a code book. The code book is a living document, which means that it's always evolving throughout the coding process. Code books should contain definitions of the code, examples of what it represents, and what it does not. Definitions and examples are important to avoid accidentally and gradually changing the meaning of a code, which is also referred to as coding drift. If you work in a team like we do, you can also have meetings where team members compare how they have coded a specific block of data and arrive at consensus when differences arise, and thus prevent coding drift. We call these sessions calibration meetings. Within the code book or in a separate document, you should also track all of your decisions and changes for your code book. This is so you can better describe your coding process in the method section when you are writing your metasynthesis manuscript later. In the next 2 slides, we will see a code and an example from our team's codebook for the Women of Color Engineering Metasynthesis project, which by the time it was finished had 18 different versions. Here is the primary code, social discomfort. As you can see in this table, we have the definition for what we mean by social discomfort, as well as examples from the literature that exemplify the code. This primary code is then followed by a secondary code, isolation, where we also provide the secondary code's definition and example. On the next slide, we will show you an excerpt taken from a piece of literature included in our Women of Color in Engineering metasynthesis that was coded as social discomfort. Here is an excerpt taken from the Alonso 2012 study. Chiara talked about seeing more opportunities because of her race and gender. Her representative quotation below illuminates the idea of how being a minority had positive and negative consequences. I've been getting a lot of opportunities just because of my gender and race. I get the double shot. It's like they're both working against me and for me at the same time. So it kind of breaks even. I was discussing with the administrative staff about reapplying. He's like, Chiara, you have 3 things going for you right now. You're Black, you're female, and you're transferring from out of state. Use it, use it, use it. That really broke my heart. Chiara, 2nd year, from Alonso 2012, page 2. The team coded this section as social discomfort because of Chiara's response to the administrative staff member. According to Chiara's narrative, the staff member was dismissive of her academic performance and only focused on her social identities. Now, Christina will walk you through what synthesis memos are and how our team uses them as part of the metasynthesis process.
Hello again. We'll now discuss synthesis memos. Our team distills information from a piece of literature into what we call a synthesis memo. A synthesis memo is a very helpful tool in a metasynthesis for condensing a long article or dissertation into a few pages. Think of it as spark notes or cliff notes. As I'll describe on the next slide, the memo will capture ideas and important quotes. On our team, we code the information on the memos instead of coding the original literature. Memos are helpful when working in a team because it helps to make the literature accessible to all team members in a shortened fashion. Thus, we work primarily with synthesis memos during the coding process. We only return to the original literature to check for accuracy as needed. There are several components to a synthesis memo. You always want to have a heading at the top that includes the date and full reference. If you're working as part of a team, be sure to write the name of the person who wrote the memo. A main idea may refer to a key concept that you or the literature piece's author identified. If you choose to use a main idea identified by the authors, ensure you use proper citation practices to signify where the idea came from. A summary by the memo writer refers to a summary of the main ideas in your own words. Writing this summary helps the memo writer ensure that they have a good understanding of what the authors are trying to say and puts it into plain language. Summary by author of literature piece refers to the paragraphs written by the authors of the study to introduce and explain their findings. When you include the summary, you ensure the presentation of the findings are as intended by the original authors. Evidence that supports the main idea refers to the data used to support the author's claims. For example, this may be interview quotes or pictures. And recommendations refer to recommendations provided by the authors that describe implications of the study's findings for future research, policy, and practice. So what does a synthesis memo look like? I will now show you a synthesis memo that I wrote for the 2012 article written by Alonso that focuses on the experiences of women of color undergraduate students in engineering. I will now just let me take one moment to switch my screens. So here's the memo that I wrote. Here's the heading, my name, the date the memo was written, and then the reference. And here are the main ideas. And as you can see here, these are the main ideas that the author of the paper, so Alonso, identified. And so I cited them with a page number. And then here's what I wrote for my summary, which this is also going to include information about the population of the study, and then also just a brief explanation of what the author summary and then the evidence is for this main idea. And here's the author summary, and then here's the evidence. And in this case, this was a quote from one of the participants in Alonso's studies. And this goes on, and it was a short conference paper, so the memo itself is short. And there were three main ideas that came out of the paper that I identified and that both the author, Alonso, identified. And then at the end, we have recommendations here. And in this conference paper, Alonso didn't have any recommendations, so I noted that in the memo. In other cases where there's longer papers and peer-reviewed articles or dissertations that are like several hundred pages long, the memos will be significantly longer, but they're still going to be more condensed than having to go back to a dissertation, which, as you know, can be up to like 200 to 400 pages. And this memo, having a memo is very helpful just to condense that information, and it makes everything more manageable when you move forward to the next step in the process of coding. So now we're going to do another hands-on activity. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to go into the Dropbox and get the memo, which should be called Alonso _memo in the Dropbox, and open that up on your computer. And this exercise is going to practice what you've learned so far about inductive coding and other like knowledge that you've already had about inductive coding. And when you look at the memo, what we would like you to do is do some inductive coding to answer the synthesis question, what factors influence women of color's persistence in undergraduate engineering education? So let's take the next 5 minutes or so to do the inductive coding exercise, and then we'll come back, do a brief debrief using another word cloud. So let's take those 5 minutes. And I will see you all in the next 5 minutes. So that is around 3:15-ish. Okay. So I'm seeing that a lot of people are on the word cloud right now. So let's look at the word cloud together. And here's the word cloud. Everyone's been adding their polls, their questions. And let's see, some of the biggest inductive codes that have come out are recognition, positive recognition, identity affirmation, and opportunities. Other codes such as feeling welcomed, intersectionality, isolation, only one are all coming up as well. So those are really great inductive codes. And a lot of those codes are encompassed in some of our own codes in our code book. So that's really great to see as it changes. Let's see, we've got some more being welcomed, minoritization, stereotypes is coming up a lot. And that's great. I see more people just keep adding in it. And it's so great to just see how the Slido changes. But the biggest one so far has remained to be recognition. So let's take a pause on the Slido. And we'll be able to circle back on this again and discuss coding further in our next couple of slides. So we're going to take a brief break from presentations and do a little bit of Q&A. So let me switch my screens.
Okay. Well, there's one general question that keeps kind of coming up here. Can you speak to about when you're looking at an article, someone talk about which aspect or part of the article are you coding and searching for? Are you mostly looking in the discussion or the findings in the discussion? But what about, say, the conclusion? Does it matter about the method or the theoretical framework? Can one of our instructors speak to that a bit more?
I have addressed this a little bit in the chat, but I will say that the instincts of the participants are good, that you want to really hone in on the findings and the discussion, or the results and the discussion. And that is where we get most of our what we call data from to code. However, different articles are formatted in different ways. Different authors make certain decisions about how and where they present information. And sometimes you will find key pieces in the introduction or in the conclusion or even in the methods. And for that reason, we read from the very beginning to the very end, knowing that most of it will be in the discussion results findings. Nuria, would you want to add anything?
The only thing I would add is that we look at the methods very closely for the filters and the quality appraisal that we've seen at the beginning. And also, so you do end up reading the entire article because you have to look at different places in the article for different purposes as you're doing the synthesis. And also, we usually create a table that we call what do we call it, Mia? If they're quantitative, qualitative, who the author is, what methods they use. So with all
attributes,
the attributes. Thank you, Christina. We create an attributes table to see what we have in our set of literature for synthesis. But that is not part of the coding. That is just to see, kind of like the landscape of the literature we have.
So along that same line, there's been a series of questions really about, does the method that the study that you're examining or synthesizing, does that make a difference? Can you have a quantitative study that's part of your meta-synthesis, your qualitative meta-synthesis?
Okay, I have actually answered that question a couple of times in the Q&A chat. So in theory, you can synthesize anything you want, quantitative, qualitative, thought pieces, anything you want. However, what we have found is that when we have tried to synthesize quantitative pieces along with qualitative pieces, it is pretty difficult to integrate the findings because they're very different in nature. So we have found it to be challenging. We use this book, and I have put it in the chat. So if you're interested in mixed methods, this book talks about mixed method synthesis. It's called Using Mixed Methods Research Synthesis for literature reviews by Heiviert, Haynes, and Ongena. And this is from 2017, I think. I'm going to put it in the chat so you have it. 2017. So we use it all the time as a reference. It's very helpful. And this will give you more pointers toward doing mixed methods synthesis.
Great. Thank you. Another question here. When you're coding the literature, how do you distinguish between primary data embedded within literature and claims made about the data presented by the author in the literature? So in terms of drawing your own conclusions from the coded literature. It's referencing, I think, in the memos that were just presented.
I can take this one. So the reason we have the memos, the memo template, the way we do, is so that we can distinguish between the claims of the author and the evidence they present, as well as, we are bringing our own lens into this as well. And so there is a section for that at that also. Ideally, let's say a student quote will be serving as evidence for a claim an author is making. That is not always the case. But if it does have that support, we try to capture both. And I think that was in the Alonso memo. So we try to capture both, and then we try to also, as the researchers comment on it, how we see it as being relevant to our synthesis question. If there is a contradiction that that the author makes a claim but does not provide evidence or has evidence that's contradictory, then we have to make a call about whether or not we should include that claim or that evidence as part of our synthesis. And we have lots of conversations in our team about that. And we want to really include, data that makes sense or claims that make sense, so that people reading a synthesis can get a strong sense of what is the literature really saying. And do you want to add anything, Nuria?
No, that sounds great. Thank you.
And just one quick follow-up then. So from your memo, do you code the memos as well? You're shaking your head, I see. All right.
We code the memos. I think Christina mentioned it, but perhaps it went by too quickly, that in place of coding the actual article or dissertation, which can be, 200, 250 pages, we condense it into a 2-page to 10-page document, and then we use the memos to code. And those memos have, they have all the pieces that we just mentioned in the template, along with the evidence.
Thank you.
And I should add that this is our project's way of doing it. I'm not familiar with anybody else who does it this way, but we do it this way for the sake of efficiency. We started doing this, I think, on my 3rd synthesis project, because it can, again, take years. The way that we do it, we are so systematic, we are so thorough, that by the time we are trying to code and analyze data, we really don't want to add another 3 years to the project. So we try to train each member of the team to hone in on what's most important in a given article and what their message is, and to come up with what are the claims and what's the evidence for those claims, and capture that. Because again, this is a synthesis, so this is not We're not repeating absolutely everything that an author will say. So it's just important to capture the main messages, and a memo can do that.
There have been many questions about using different software packages. I know as you smile there. Is there any things that you suggest in terms of coding? People are asking about. So can you use something like Atlas TI instead of a memo, or things of that nature, or as part of your coding process?
So we have a section. Christina is going to do a demonstration of a qualitative data analysis software package we use, NVivo. I have, though, on my schedule that we should take a short break. It has been over an hour. Do you want to do a quick break?
Should we do 5 minutes instead of 10? So that we don't run over the 4 o'clock end time?
Sure. We can do a 5-minute break if you all agree. You give people a chance to stand up and things.
Yeah.
And we will we'll take a break. So why don't we say that we'll come back at 1/2 the hour? So it's 3:30 Eastern.
Okay.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It is 3:30 Eastern time. So we're 1/2, and I hope everyone has been able to jump back on after that short 5-minute break. And now we're going to move on to qualitative data analysis software, which was a hot topic in the chat. So let's talk about qualitative data analysis, or QDA software, and how we use it in metasynthesis. In the previous slides, we covered creating memos and coding them. And after this step, you could choose to transfer the codes and coded data from the memos to a QDA software, or you can continue doing analysis manually. For our team, we choose to do that extra step of coding the data in the Word doc, in the memos, and then transferring all into the QDA software, and in our case, it's NVivo. So our team uses NVivo, but most software of this type works in a similar way. We use QDA software because it allows us to store, organize, and track a complex hierarchy of primary and secondary codes. It also allows us to quickly gather data together to explore them with the query function. The query function allows you to look at the data that you have coded in different ways, such as the frequency of a code and the intersection of codes. In other words, it allows you to look at how the data intersects in particular ways, helping to identify patterns and relationships. We want to emphasize, however, that the tough cognitive work of analysis falls on the researcher. The software is just an organization and storage tool. It will not do the actual coding for you. As many QDA software packages are not completely intuitive, you will want to build in time to learn how to use it. I will now do a demonstration of how our team uses NVivo for data storage, organization, and analysis of codes. So let me take a moment to switch screens. So here is our NVivo, and as you can see on this left panel, this blue panel here, this is where all of our data is, and this is where all of our coding goes in terms of like putting in the individual codes into NVivo, so that when we go into NVivo, we can code everything there. So what I want to show you is within our Engineering Beyond the Double Bind project that we've been using for many of our exercises, we've already moved all of those memos in, and at the time, it looks like there were 68 memos created for the synthesis. And what I want to show you next is in the coding, I'll show you some of our codes. Here are some of our codes that were used for the synthesis project. But what I want to show you that is most interesting to everyone here is that query function we were talking about, the query wizard on NVivo. It's going to give you various options of what you'd like to do with the codes that you've input into NVivo. First option is see where particular terms occur in content. The second is identify frequently occurring terms in content. The third is search for content based on how it is coded. And the fourth, find coding intersections between two lists of items. So this fourth option is what we find most interesting for our work. And what we use a lot when we're looking at analysis. So we're going to click that fourth function of find coding intersections between two lists of items, and we're going to press next. And this is here, it's going to ask you the kinds of codes or the attributes that you want to look at. But we're going to select the codes, and we're going to go into the codes folder, go into the track one, which was where we did the memos and the coding. And we're going to select support entities. And support entities for this code referred to family, teachers, professors, advisors, friends. And we're going to press OK. And so that code has been selected. And now we're going to press next. And we're going to do the same thing. But this time we're going to pick a different code so we can see how the two codes intersect. So we're going to click again on the same set of codes. And at this point, I want to look at navigation, which for our team's definition, navigation refer to strategies used by the participants or the participants' support entities that helped in their persistence in engineering. And then we're going to run the query. And as you can see, when the data was coded, it's been coded 26 times, both support entities and navigation. So we're going to click that, and it's going to populate all of the excerpts that have been coded, both support entities and navigation. And at this point, what our team would do is we would copy and paste all of this information and export it into a Word document. And that way, we're going to be able to go into the next step, which is going to be looking at descriptive themes from the data. And Mia will talk about that next. So let me switch my screens, and Mia can take the floor.
Thank you, Christina. So we will now move on to Module 4, Thematic Analysis. So once coding is completed, the next step in the analytic process is thematic analysis, which is a fancy way of saying it's a process of developing themes. We refer to thematic analysis as the second cycle of analysis following the first cycle of coding. A theme is a name given to a broad, overarching concept that answers the synthesis question. A common way of conducting thematic analysis is taking smaller codes and unifying them under a broader concept. Doing thematic analysis has three major advantages. It provides a structure to identify important themes. It allows the synthesis authors to attend to themes that arise frequently. And it encourages exploration of whether and how these themes align with the synthesis question or topic. Adapting the ideas of methodologists James Thomas and Angela Hardin, there are three steps to conducting thematic analysis. The first step is to code the literature. As Lisette presented earlier, literature may be coded using inductive, deductive, or hybrid coding. The second step is to develop descriptive themes, which is when you cluster the codes under a unifying concept that reflects what is being highlighted in the literature. In this step, you will organize your codes based on their similarities or differences. The third step, which is the final step, is the generation of analytical themes that cluster your descriptive themes together. Analytical themes will take the descriptive themes further by emphasizing a greater main idea that specifically addresses your synthesis question. So we're going to do another hands-on activity to practice the second step, developing descriptive themes. So we will ask you to practice identifying descriptive themes using 2 pages of real data from one of our metasynthesis projects. You'll find the data set in the Dropbox link in a document labeled Thematic Analysis Exercise. The data in this document were literature passages that we coded as social discomfort. These were associated with undergraduate experiences for women of color engineering students. So now let's just say 3 minutes and analyze these data and write down some descriptive themes. So if you are looking for commonalities, so this is, you are looking for commonalities that tie 2 or more of these passages together that address the synthesis question. So recall that the synthesis question is, what factors influence women of color's persistence in undergraduate engineering education? So Lisette has put the, so we will do another text poll at the end of these 3 minutes, and Lisette will be putting in the Slido poll in a few minutes. So what I'm seeing is a lot of overlap with the work that my project has done with, for example, lack of belonging or sense of belonging, isolation, how intersectionality or intersecting opportunities or barriers, stereotype and stereotype threat, that certainly does come up in our analyses. So this is a great list. So thank you very much. These are really very insightful. And so thank you to our poll participants. And so keep these responses in mind and keep your own responses in mind as I go through an example of how our team identified the themes from data coded as social discomfort, along with 2 other related codes for a recent metasynthesis publication. This is just our example. Your themes may be different from ours, and that is perfectly fine, as long as your themes address the synthesis question, and you can provide evidence of each theme. So here is an illustration of the 3 steps of thematic analysis introduced by Thomas and Hardin as they apply to our own research on women of color in engineering. So first, we took 3 separate codes: social discomfort, isolation, and microaggressions, and grouped them together into descriptive themes. We looked for similarities and differences between the codes and started to group them accordingly. New terms were developed to capture the meaning of groups of initial codes. These became the descriptive themes of culture of exclusion and hostility, peers and negative experiences, and encountering stereotypes. From here, we went further and looked for the relationships between the descriptive themes. This led us to adapting and developing an analytic theme of social pain, which is an umbrella term borrowed from social psychology, used to describe closely related phenomena that are based on the experience of negative social interactions. We should note that no STEM education literature has mentioned social pain that we know of. That was a frame that we brought into the analysis. This step of developing analytic themes is one of the main ways we put the meta in metasynthesis. So far, we have seen the first 2 cycles of the analytic process, where we have moved from data to codes and codes to themes. After these 2 cycles, we move from the more specific and concrete to the more general and abstract by developing the findings and then the discussion. These last 2 cycles are the most visible ones because they are part of the publishable manuscript. Due to limitations of time, we won't elaborate on these last 2 cycles, but we'll talk about them more in depth in our intensive workshops. The findings in a manuscript summarize and describe what we have learned in the metasynthesis and answer the metasynthesis questions. There are many ways to organize metasynthesis findings, but the most common are by the themes identified during thematic analysis and by how they answer the synthesis questions. The discussion in a manuscript presents the theoretical and practical significance of the metasynthesis findings and looks at the findings through the lens of the theoretical framework that you select earlier in the metasynthesis process. The discussion section typically identifies trends, strengths and limitations, convergence or divergence, ways to extend current theory, and recommendations. However, different disciplines and journals may locate the recommendations for practice and for future research in the conclusion section, and the limitations section may be required as part of your methods section. Find out the preferences of your discipline or the specific journal in which you want to publish, and draft your discussion section accordingly. So if this webinar were a 4-day intensive workshop, at this point, we would move on to talk about using the skills we presented today to develop a metasynthesis manuscript for publication. Then we would talk about developing a proposal to get funding for a qualitative metasynthesis project. We do not have time to cover these topics today, unfortunately, but if any of you are interested in participating in a full-length workshop, please contact Lisette at the email address on the screen. So we have arrived at the end of our presentation. Thank you all for attending our webinar. Before we pause for Q&A, we want to thank our host, colleagues, partners, advisors, and sponsor. And now we can take questions and ask George to moderate for us.
Great, thank you. Wow, this time is just going by so quickly here that we get down to this sort of last time for formal questions. I'll remind everyone that we will have this informal time at 4:30 Eastern time, 4:30 to 5:15. I'll put the question in or the link to that into the chat. One of the things that I want to ask is, one general question has come up: what are some of the pitfalls that beginners to metasynthesis? What do you find there? Some of the problems that new people using metasynthesis encounter?
I have answered that question in the Q&A, and I'll try to answer here again, but Mia, please add to my response. I think one of the main issues that a beginner may encounter is putting together a synthesis question that's too broad and that will take too much work and too long of a period of time to be able to answer as an individual researcher, as an individual author of synthesis. So I think the first thing that a beginner might want to consider is testing things out and look at what the literature out there is like, and how they may be able to narrow down a synthesis question that is doable, and that is interesting for them, and that is relevant for the gaps of the literature. So narrow down a synthesis question, and then if with that they still find a lot of literature, maybe they want to narrow down the criteria that they use, so they can eliminate some of the unwieldy literature that they may find. And if they can get funding and a team, that would be fantastic. But as a beginner, that might be difficult to do.
Can you also give some tips or suggestions for deciding upon the synthesis question?
I think before you embark on the synthesis, you can test the waters. You can do, some informal searches. I think one of the most underused professionals on any university campus is the librarian. Become friends with the librarian. They know all the tricks for getting literature, and just come with your question and ask, make an appointment to spend an hour looking through things. And you'll get a sense right away if your question is too big or too small. Come with, create a few search strings, do the exercises that we went through with you today, and show this to your librarian, or you can do it on your own. But you can test the waters before you go deep into it, because you just don't want to be distressed, many months or years down the line that it's just not, you haven't completed, your project. I will add to, when you asked the question, George, I had these flashbacks to my very first project, the IDB project. So Nuria mentioned working in a team, and I was working in a team, but you have to make sure that you all share the same vision, and you all share the same idea of what a synthesis is. And I had a conversation recently with a program officer at the National Science Foundation who thought you could just put a synthesis together over the weekend. And what she was thinking about was a literature review, and perhaps in her field that's possible, but not in STEM education. So you just have to make sure that everybody you work with understands the tasks ahead of you and understands the labor that's involved. And I hope you have understood from this talk we gave today, it is extremely labor intensive. And it's a very good thing that, all the people on our team like each other and are on the same page about what it takes to create something of a really high quality synthesis. Because I ended up, for my first project, working solo a lot of nights and weekends. And, yes, I had a great deal of help, but there were also a lot of tears too. I'll just say that.
So that's a good point you make too. I was asked a question too that's come up about teams. Does the metasynthesis have to be done with a team? Can it be done as one person's project?
So we just, I mentioned our advisor, Mara Borrego, who is a professor at the University of Texas, Austin, and she mentioned one of her students who was able to create a synthesis. I think it was like 2 semesters in the summer in between. Am I saying that right, team? So it took about like a little less than a year, and this person got published. But I think a lot of it had to do with her work was structured within a class. She had Mara as a professor and advisor. So she had some supports there. So it can be done. But I think it depends on if you're going to do it solo, be very careful about the question you are asking and the topic you are choosing. And by that, I mean, don't choose something that has tens of thousands of articles already written. Choose something a little bit more esoteric, and then it'll be okay.
Another question here is, in general, how are you differentiating between, say, codes, which in they're using descriptive themes, analytic themes, from coding using content analysis that generate a matrix where there are indicators, subcategories, categories, dimensions?
I'll take that. It's a different type of approach to coding. With content analysis, what you're doing is quantifying, and you're making decisions about what counts as what. So you're counting how many people have talked about, I don't know, like persistence and success, and you lump those together, and you have your own definition of what that is, and you count how many instances of that you get. That is content analysis, and you're making the decisions about those categories. In thematic analysis, we don't count things, even though we could with in vivo. It gives you, like how many times we've coded this way. We don't really look at the numbers. The only reason why we may look at the numbers is that if we don't have enough evidence to really develop a theme about a certain topic, then we feel really bad because we really like that theme, but we need to eliminate it from our meta findings, right? So your assumptions and your goals with the analysis is different. In one, you want to count, you want to quantify, and in the other, you want to develop themes that explain experiences and realities for the people who have lived those things. And you want to explain them in a way that makes sense for a big group of people, but that have specific examples from particular individuals that will show how that more general finding expresses itself through those examples. So you can count with thematic analysis, but that's not your goal.
Thank you. Yeah, there have been lots of good questions here. Well, I guess we're to our last 3 minutes of the course. Any final words from each of our instructors? If we all come back on and
I would just say one thing that I've been trying to answer some of the questions in the Q&A. I see a lot of quantitative language being applied to qualitative work. I would remind people that here we're talking about qualitative metasynthesis. So some of the language, or a lot of the language that you use for quantitative research, will not apply for this. So things like frequencies or factors in the quantitative sense of what a factor is, or like what was one that came up talking about what's the strength of your findings and things like that. Those don't apply to this kind of work. This is qualitative. So when you're looking at things like strength, in qualitative work, what we talk about is things like trustworthiness. And we are looking at, like sufficient, what counts as sufficient evidence. It's like, well, do your findings match with your the evidence that you're using? Does it make sense? Does this example make sense as an example of this explanation? Do you have, is it specific enough? Is it granted, etc.? So you need to be very careful in not trying to use quantitative methods to do qualitative work, because it just doesn't mesh. If you want to do mixed methods, there's a whole language for mixed methods that you need to familiarize yourself with, and it's as valid as doing quantitative or qualitative work. It's just that we need to make decisions that are consistent with the methods and the epistemological reality that we are looking at from our perspective. What is our paradigm when we're working with this thing? So if you use qualitative methods, you're looking at a qualitative paradigm, everything needs to be consistent across your work. So I would recommend people to do a good deep dive into a good intro book on qualitative research methods, and then a good read on some of the work that we have shared with you in the references list, so that you get familiarized with qualitative metasynthesis work. Those are a little bit my final words, because I was looking at a lot of questions that came from a very quantitative perspective, and it's like, it just doesn't work with this, the way you're thinking it.
So Nuria, real quick to add to that, we'll be covering that in our intensives, in the sense that when we're writing up our findings, the importance of transparency and stating your positionality and how you're approaching the work is key. So that's probably something we should have emphasized, but the reason why we're asking you all to keep track of all of your decisions is because in order to be transparent and to fulfill that sense of validity, you want to be able to say clearly, this is what exactly I did, so people can follow you.
That's a great point. The positionality of the synthesis authors, it has to work together with the paradigm that you choose, your positionality, the theoretical framework that we chose at the beginning, remember, and your synthesis question. So everything needs to be consistent. Otherwise, like, it falls apart and it doesn't make sense. Thank you, Lisette. That was a very good point.
Okay, any other last word from our instructors? Dr. Ong, Christina,
Well,
Silva?
I'm following the chat a little bit, and there's some really great, kind words coming from audience members. So thank you so much for letting us know that you appreciate this. My team, I just want to give a shout out to my team. They did such a great job. We have worked so hard to prepare this, and I'm glad that people are finding it valuable to them. I also see, we thought we were being completely comprehensive, but by the questions that have been coming since the minute we started, clearly we have some gaps that we need to fill in. So the next time we do this, we will be addressing those questions. So thank you all very much.
And I just will say thank you all for attending and watching us speak and share some of our work with you. I know that the 3 hours just flew by, and it's really hard to get deep into everything as much as we want to get deep into everything. So please reach out to Lisette. Join us for some intensive workshops. Be on the lookout. We are going to do some asynchronous work as well. So if you can't join us for the synchronous intensive workshops, we're going to have that website. It's going to launch, and you'll be able to learn how to do metasynthesis. And I look forward to the next couple of years to see what everyone else gets to write about, because this is great. Thank you so much.
And I want to give you all a hand. Thank you so much for this workshop. This has been great.
And George, thank you for organizing this and for moderating. We appreciate it.
I do this, and thank our staff, my colleagues at AERA for helping put this together. And of course, as always, the National Science Foundation and their support of our work.
Yes.
Thank you. So again, we're stopping the formal course. We're going to take a break, and at 4:30 Eastern time, we will come back for an informal discussion. I have put the link into the chat that will be you will use a Zoom link, and now, Christina, if you stop sharing, I'll post this as well so everyone can see this, and we will meet everyone at 4:30 for our informal time. Bring your coffee, as I like to think about at that time, and we can all talk at that point.
Or wine.
Or wine, yes, it's happy hour. So it is literally at this point now at 4:30. So it's evening. So this is great. Thank you again. We'll see you soon.